call Charlotte Leslie to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I beg to move that this House has considered the question of Gulf relations with Britain. And I'd like to refer members to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests. I've been lucky enough to go on two trips to the UAE and to Bahrain in recent months. I fear that for many years to come, any debate like this regarding the Middle East will be prefaced by the phrase, "This could not be a more timely debate." That is until there's not a lot going on in the Middle East, which I sadly suspect will not be any time soon. And I'm afraid this debate is particularly timely. Why? Well, I could say it's timely economically. With the effect of the Iran deal being seen in plummeting oil prices, this is a time of turmoil or a renewables revolution for the region and all those who are linked with it. I could say it's time for the West to be clearer to its historic allies about who its friends actually are. I could argue that this is a time to seize economic opportunities. In Dubai's Jebel Ali Airport and London Gateway collaboration, the Emirates' investment in London, and hopefully the UAE's investment in Portsmouth, after the member who has just taken her place lobbied so excellently but wearyingly to the rest of the delegation for UAE embassy investment in her constituency. I could also talk about security. I could say, look at Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and the humanitarian crisis these conflicts create and the effect on Europe. I could point out this is a time to recognise the UAE's increased military activity and high-level capability and the implications of that in the region.
Would the Honourable Lady give way on that point?
I'd be delighted to give way.
Thank you, Mr Nuttall. Would the Honourable Lady agree with me that the UAE is a forefront runner in the area for using the airstrips and helping out the Allies in military airstrikes against Daesh?
My honourable friend makes a good point, and I think we should be looking very closely at just how the UAE facilitates our shared battle against extremism, which is something that I'm going to go on to talk about. I could also say socially, that amidst issues regarding human rights and questions over Wahhabism's role in extremism, Saudi embarks upon a time of enormous transition against a backdrop of a changing Iran and an Arab-sprung, now perfect storm. I could point to the little-known role the UAE is taking in accommodating Syrian refugees. But I'm not going to say much on any of that, because I'm sure my colleagues, such as the member for Mid-Sussex and for Rutland and many others here today, who have far more experience than I do in these areas, will cover these topics magnificently. Now, I want to open this debate by talking about something a little less trodden. And I'm going to open by giving you some lines from a musical. In Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice's musical Jesus Christ Superstar, a newly dead Judas accosts a soon-to-be-crucified Jesus with some slightly aggressive questions. And he says, "Every time I look at you, I don't understand why you came at such a strange time and to such a strange land. If you'd come today, you could have reached the whole nation. Israel in 4 BC had no mass communication." This line touches on something so fundamental to the Gulf and its politics that we cannot discuss the Gulf region without it. But yet it's something which Western politics has such an inadequate currency of thought and language with which to discuss it. And that is Islam and its values today. Islam, a religion that is inseparable in its content from the Arab Peninsula, and now perhaps in its own 1400s, going through an enlightenment or reformation process that Christianity so brutally and bloodily went through in its own medieval calendar period. But this reformation is happening with AK-47s, global travel, and the internet, that mass communication. And because of global travel and mass communication, Islam's internal challenges are not only the problem of the Gulf and the Middle East, it is now a European religion too. So Islam's challenges are challenges for everybody. The West has been very good at debating political solutions, using political institutions, and security solutions, using military equipment. But none of this touches on a thing at the heart of what is going on in the faith of Islam, a thing that has either become a victim of language inflation through abstract noun overuse, or remarkably unfashionable, and that is values. I was struck when the UAE ambassador to Russia His Excellency Omar Saif Grobash, put it to me like this: "We are politicising our ethics," he said, "when we should be ethicizing our politics." In what could be called a Western values vacuum, perhaps born of a bourgeois squeamishness about anything absolute in a relativist post-secular world, I have found that some of the most sophisticated understanding of extremism has come from the Gulf. In many ways, this is not surprising. Gulf nations have real skin in the game, the continuation of their very society in the face of the chaos around them. And Gulf nations are at home and understand in a way that the West finds hard to digest the role of religion and faith and their values as integral to politics and political thinking. For example, when I commented on in the UAE the prevalence of very conspicuous long-term thinking in their dialogue, a minister pointed out to me that it would be dishonourable for a leader not to leave a very fine legacy of long-term thinking for the next generation. Because in Islam, the idea that man is here only for a season and it is his legacy that is important is embedded in their way of thought. A perfect example of where political thinking and faith are inseparable. We're used to discussing, and it is right to do so, and I'm sure colleagues here will do, how emerging Middle Eastern societies can benefit from the experience of the West in forging relatively stable, free speech societies that respect human rights, and I know colleagues will do so. We're also very used to discussing the military and economic collaborations that benefit both partners. And again, I look forward to that discussion. I know there are many members here with great experience on that. I'd be delighted to give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable member. Just before she moves on, I wonder if she would just comment and take this opportunity to pay tribute to President Obama in his last months as President of the United States of America. And in terms of his long-term thinking about the Gulf region, what legacy has he left to that area?
I don't envy President Obama's role, given the legacy that he was left with of just how disastrous short-term and arrogant thinking can be from the West in invading Iraq. I was very against the Iraq War, and sadly I think my preconceptions then outside this place have borne testament now. The role of America ongoing and the lack of trust the Middle East now has in many ways for that state is going to be a challenge we're all going to have to meet. And I actually also pay tribute to John Kerry in his work in beginning to forge some kind of relationship, which is extremely difficult. But moving on, some of the most sophisticated understanding of extremism that I have come across was at the UAE Hidayah Centre, a centre dedicated to looking at extremism and its causes. And they deconstructed several political common misconceptions. And the first misconception is that extremism is born simply of poverty. It is not. It is about much more than just poverty. And to equate ending extremism with simply ending poverty is misled and dangerous. After all, Sayyid Qutb, the Egyptian academic who inspired the Takfiri thinking of al-Qaeda, was far from poor. But his life and his writings, and I do recommend reading this to anyone who's interested in the region and the birth of extremism, his life and writings from an early autobiography, The Child from the Village, to his later famous explosive book, Milestones, show that he did feel isolated. A telling passage describes, in third person, his response to an event engraved on his adult consciousness of, as a young boy, spending just a day in a less progressive school than his usual one. He says, "Our child," that's referring to himself, Qutb, "his soul was filled with repugnance at everything that surrounded him. He felt bitter, abject loneliness." His response? To become, in his own words, age 6, a missionary in what he calls his progressive school's struggle against the less sophisticated school. This isolated and bitter, rather pampered and spoiled primary school boy later went as a student to America, felt even more isolated and bitter, and returned with a new struggle as an Islamic extremist missionary. He attempted to execute Egypt's president, whom he saw as a traitor to Islam, was imprisoned and executed by Nasser in 1966, and has become a celebrated martyr by the Muslim Brotherhood. This man has been credited as the creator of Takfiri Islam, that provides a convenient clause that if someone, even a fellow Muslim, doesn't think like you, they're no Muslim and can be killed. Now, the story of the privileged Saeed Qutb illustrates very well the simple point made by the UAE Hidayah anti-extremism movement. It is not all about poverty. And those who seek to join extremist groups seek something that is not so very different from what any human being seeks, and that is identity, community, and purpose. The mission, then, is how to provide something more attractive than what Daesh provides, that meets the needs of these disaffected and often young people. A way out of poverty is doubtless part of it, but we are completely wrong if we think it's a simple answer. I'd be delighted to.
Honourable friend for giving way. She makes the point that extremism isn't to do with poverty, but would she agree that it might be to do with underemployment? And in some states, the nature of the economy means that there is a large pool of young people who really don't have enough to do in terms of meaningful jobs.
Absolutely, and I think this is a case of identifying symptoms and illustrations and their causes. So I would argue that, yes, employment is a crucial part of it, because if you're not employed, a part of your identity is taken away, certainly your work community is taken away, and your purpose is certainly taken away. So it's very much a manifestation of those things, but I believe that in really understanding what we're tackling, we have to understand the root underlying dynamics, of which, of course, she makes an excellent point that unemployment, joblessness and poverty is part, necessary perhaps, but not sufficient. The second reality that Hidayah offered up was the prosaic observation that whilst tackling root ideology has a place, simply telling people very strongly that their actions are wrong and they shouldn't do it is pretty useless. And I'll insert a quote from the life of Brian: "Don't do it again." We can't be surprised when this doesn't work. For a political world where we can seldom find any initial response to atrocities such as those in Brussels and Paris, other than to tell the perpetrators we condemn them very strongly, this rather unsurprising fact should be very sobering. Hidayah points out that for an individual to choose an alternative path, the alternative must not only match Daesh's offer on identity, community and purpose, but also the practical reality on security and welfare as well. If Daesh promises security to a frightened man wanting to feed his children, a viable alternative has got to be more than a moral lecture. So these insights from the Gulf help clarify what our response should be and what our challenges actually are. How to forge that alternative to Daesh, a value system, identity, community and purpose that competes on providing welfare and a sense of risk and achievement. How to build that compelling and exciting muscular moderation. And then, perhaps an even more difficult question, who is the forceful, charismatic leader of this muscular moderation? The daddy, the Abu Bakr Baghdadi, the Zarqawi, the Bin Laden, the Saeed Qutb. Who is the hero of this muscular moderation? Where is the leader in this subversive new movement that casts Daesh as a stale establishment, their hatred as weak and infantile, and promotes a rebellious and resolute compassion for those who are different from oneself, or even who don't like you, as the strong and manly thing to do? I'd be delighted to.
Giving way and congratulate her on securing the debate. Just on the issue that she's on at the moment, would you agree with me that quite often, irrespective of the motivation of those of us in the West, we are almost always seen to be trying to impose some sort of external values, not just in the Middle East, but particularly in the Gulf, in relation to this discussion. And that what we do need to see is what she's on now, which is the intrinsic belief and views of people in the region themselves who need to show the leadership to lead their communities out of the morass into which many of those nations have sunk in recent years.
Yeah, look, Leslie.
Thank the Honourable Member for making that good point. We often forget that often the messenger is more important than the message itself, because the message is fundamentally defined by who's giving it. And he raises the point that I'll be touching on later on. Thank you. There was a third insight, which I found very striking and very relevant to our relations with the Gulf, that was offered by His Excellency Dr. Anwar Gargash, the UAE Minister for State for Foreign Affairs. And he talks of the dangers of a digital world, where, as he puts it, my opinion has become my religion. This observation speaks not only to the role of the internet in spreading Daesh's message, that mass communication that Tim Rice's Judas was so lamenting the lack of, but it also speaks to fundamental changes that digital technology appears to affect on people's thought. What I have called elsewhere a change from cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, to sentio ergo sum, I feel therefore I am, or even sentio ergo est, I feel therefore it is, where a person's feeling dictates absolute truth. And I know as MPs in this room, we have all seen it, on social media in particular, that dangerous trend, that false premise that says, I am human, I think this, you do not think what I think, therefore you are not human. That false premise is the seed of genocide. It is the beginning of takfiri mentality that extends its blind intolerance way beyond the scope of Islam. We are beginning to see it in the hate diatribes of UK far-left groups, which we now see as sympathetic to Hamas and Hezbollah and other extremist terrorist groups. This is a very, very slippery slope. All these insights are from the hard end of battling extremism in the Gulf. And it is easy for the West to forget that the majority of casualties of Daesh are Muslim, that Daesh want to punish nations like the UAE for poisoning, in inverted commas, the sacred Arab peninsula with pluralism. And it is easy to forget that Sunni Gulf states are concerned about the rise of an emboldened Shia militia as Iran re-enters the global economy in its reintroduction to our world. And the response to the Gulf to extremism may provide a learning opportunity for Britain. And I would ask the Minister specifically what assessment he's made of the UAE's clampdown on extremist teaching in schools, the UAE's policy towards registering imams in mosques, and whether he thinks there are lessons that can be learnt from this. And I'd also ask him more specifically, will he keep an open mind on Britain's classification of the Muslim Brotherhood? An extremely good way of working out whether they are actually moderate friends who can be engaged with on political terms, or whether they will renounce the writings, teachings, and celebrated martyrdom of Sayyid Qutb. If they refuse to renounce Sayyid Qutb, we may need to urgently reassess what we think of them in our political context. We cannot afford to be squeamish on this. In conclusion, I've only talked about what Britain might learn from its relationship with the Gulf. Yes.
Very attentively to what she's saying, but I wonder if she'd also join me in asking the Minister to look at the human rights abuses in the UAE, where there are 27 Britons currently detained, some of whom have complained of torture, and indeed, I think in the last 5 years, 37 British nationals have made allegations of torture or mistreatment there.
Charlotte Leslie.
Absolutely, I would ask the Minister that. And what I was going to go on to say is that, I suppose rather unusually, I have talked about what Britain can learn from the Gulf, because I know that members such as himself will probably be able to speak very powerfully on the other areas we need to look at. And it is very easy to morally carp from the sidelines on issues such as human rights, which are of a huge concern to us all. But that is not always the best way, well, it's seldom a good way at all, to actually achieve the practical change that we want to see. And I would argue very strongly that if we want to see Gulf nations improve their human rights, improve their freedom of speech, which essentially will secure their own security far more effectively, the way to do it is to engage. I'm going to finish by talking of, referring to something His Excellency Sheikh Nahyan Mubarak Al Nahyan's comments he made on how the UAE has actually managed to achieve such pluralism whilst maintaining the Emiratis' confident identity as rather conservative Muslims, which I also think applies very well to international relations and the member's previous comments. He says, pluralism is not diversity alone, but the energetic engagement with diversity. Pluralism is not simply tolerance, but the active quest for understanding along lines of difference. Pluralism demands dialogue, and dialogue does not mean that everyone at the table will agree with one another. There is much with which we can engage on the UAE, and I take the members' points about human rights, much to work with from our history with Bahrain, and I know that we'll hear some fascinating comments firsthand from observations of colleagues who visited Saudi and other Gulf states. But I'd just like to finish with a point made to me by the Exceptional Minister of State for International Cooperation, Her Excellency Weem Al-Hashmi, one of the incredibly impressive women ministers in this highly conservative Muslim society in the UAE. And she emphasised that UAE could not export its pluralism to neighbours simply by preaching. It could only demonstrate the possibility of such a pluralism within that conservative Muslim state by doing. So I hope this debate is in some way instrumental in Britain continuing to meet the challenge that Britain and Gulf states both share across our differences by listening, talking, understanding and doing. Thank you.